Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, being that this is a hair loss channel, I offer a lot of advice that centers around the use of pharmaceutical interventions to stop the progression of androgenic alopecia. I mean, why wouldn't I? I want the advice I offer on this channel to be helpful, so obviously it makes perfect sense that I would recommend pharmaceutical treatments like finasteride and minoxidil to my viewers. They are clinically proven to work and have a very good safety profile, thus ensuring that the vast majority of people will respond well to the treatments. I know that if I were to start telling people to waste their time by trying all these unproven hippie woo natural treatments like scalp massages, essential oils, and laser therapy, then I would just be wasting my viewers' time and their hair, and that is completely unacceptable to me. I run a hair loss channel after all, so it would be an anathema if the advice I gave cost other viewers their hair. However, because I often promote medical treatments, I have had some viewers complain about my motives. They say things like, "Kevin, you're a Big Pharma propagandist. Don't you know that they're only driven by profit?"
今日医者に入院を勧められたよ。
入院？それはしない方がいいですね。病院は施設が悪いくせに儲けることばかり考えて入院を勧めているんです。
Don't you know how many people have been hurt by the pharmaceutical industry? You should be ashamed of yourself, bro.
How dare you?
So let me address all of this in the most straightforward way I possibly can. Do I support Big Pharma? Does my content help to advance the interest of the pharmaceutical industry? Am I a Big Pharma drug pusher? The answer to all of that? Hell yes I am! What kind of moron would I have to be not to be pro-Big Pharma? Now, before we get all excited and write your angry comments below, let me be clear. There are plenty of things about the pharmaceutical industry that warrant intense criticism, and indeed, a lot of the common criticisms you hear about pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, and the Umbrella Corporation are all true. And I'll get into that shortly, but when it comes to treating any condition, whether it be hair loss, heart disease, cancer, or even less severe things like the common cold, you have to compare what Big Pharma has to offer to what the alternative is. And in that context, Big Pharma is by far the better choice. When I think about pharmaceutical companies and factor in all the pros and cons and what they contribute to society, I am reminded of an important quote from one of my favorite political leaders of all time, Winston Churchill. He said, quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others," unquote. That is the perfect analogy to the present state of the pharmaceutical industry as we know it. For all of its faults, pharmaceutical companies do far more good than harm, and for every health or cosmetic problem that humanity faces today, it is the pharmaceutical industry who offer us the best option by far. Before I get into that though, I did mention earlier that there are plenty of valid criticisms about Big Pharma, so let's go over all of that first. The first problem, which I find absolutely abhorrent, is the excessive and misleading advertising of prescription drugs directly to patients. If you don't live in either the United States or New Zealand, then you probably don't know about this stance, since those are the only two countries in the world where it is actually legal to advertise prescription drugs. Not only are these ads over-the-top offensive, but they do much more harm than good. First, they are clearly high-budget productions, so they waste a lot of money that should be going into the research and development of new drugs. Second, even though the drug companies claim they are educational, they all basically just show really happy people having a really good time while someone very rapidly reads a list of side effects that are totally incomprehensible to the average layman. The people in the commercial always keep smiling even when the voiceover says the drugs can kill you. The ads even include drugs like cancer chemotherapy drugs for terminal cancer. I mean, with something as complicated and deadly as cancer, should it really be up to the patients to choose what drug they want to take? That should be something that is discussed strictly between the patient and the doctor. Also, I'm sure that doctors who spend several years in medical school learning about various treatments for diseases are completely sick of hearing from patients who come into their office and ask why they aren't getting the latest drug they saw on TV. Also, the drugs on TV are usually the most expensive and newest drugs, where there are oftentimes older, cheaper drugs that work just as well that are better options. But you never hear about those drugs on TV because they're off patent and thus not profitable anymore. So a lot of patients are wasting money on newer, expensive drugs and aren't even aware of the cheaper alternatives thanks to all this marketing. So I kind of understand why this is happening in the United States, where advertising is felt to be a form of free speech and the drug lobbies have a lot of influence in Congress. But what's up with New Zealand here? New Zealand is where Lord of the Rings was filmed, so I would expect better from the nation that defeated the Dark Lord Sauron and liberated Middle Earth. The next big problem is price gouging. You guys recognize this sack of shit here? Who wouldn't want to punch that douchebag in the face? That's Marchlewska, a former pharmaceutical executive who is notorious for raising the price of Daraprim, an HIV medication, by 5,455%, which shot the price of the drug from $13.50 to $750 per pill. Eventually, Marchlewska was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but it was for reasons completely unrelated to the price gouging controversy, and that is due to all the lax regulation over such greed-driven practices. This has become a common enough problem that many people who rely on drugs find themselves completely unable to afford them, which may be one of the reasons people turn to bullshit alternative woo to begin with. Another example is insulin. Big Pharma has been price gouging insulin for years. It makes it completely unaffordable for many people. Fortunately, recent laws may finally get this under control by imposing price caps. It's weird though, because insulin has been around for a very long time. It shouldn't be under patent. In fact, it is a naturally occurring substance that is produced by the human body, so how can it even be patented in the first place? The drug companies have manipulated the patent system so much over the years that they have been able to put their brands of insulin under patent, and this, along with a lack of competition, has resulted in sky-high insulin pricing, which, like I said, are fortunately now coming down thanks to government regulation. Lastly, and probably the most egregious problem, is the overhyping and the resulting overprescription of some seriously dangerous drugs, like opioids that are extremely addictive and deadly. Some new government regulation has since curbed this abuse, but sadly, the damage has already been done, and we have thousands of people addicted to opioids now. This was definitely the fault of drug companies that minimized the risk of addiction, but there are other guilty parties to blame for this problem as well. It didn't help that doctors have been forced by regulators to consider pain as the fifth vital sign, even though pain is subjective and not an objective vital sign like taking a temperature or measuring a pulse rate. What that means is that nurses were constantly asking patients to rate their pain levels from a scale of 1 to 10, and hospitals were judged by how well they controlled their patients' pain. This was one of the major factors leading to the overprescription of narcotic painkillers. I think the situation was also made worse by what I consider to be the ill-advised decision by the FDA to take Vioxx off the market in 2004. You heard that right, chums. I'm defending Vioxx here. I think it was a huge mistake to remove Vioxx from the market. Even though the drug was associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular complications, at the same time, it was widely regarded as the most successful non-narcotic painkiller ever created. It would have been much better to leave Vioxx on the market with restrictions against prescribing it in people with heart disease or who are at high risk of heart disease rather than ban it completely, since the result of that ban was the opioid crisis. This isn't just me speculating either. There is a study that examined this issue closely, and I'll link it below, but it basically concluded that after the Vioxx recall, use of non-opioid painkillers fell out of favor, and this directly led to the opioid crisis we are still suffering through today. Also, we now know that the increased cardiovascular risk from Vioxx was not isolated to Vioxx. It is a problem that occurs with all drugs in this class, even drugs you can buy over the counter like ibuprofen and naproxen. In this study here, you could see that all NSAIDs increase the risk of heart attack, stroke, and death to various degrees. So Vioxx was the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, but all these other drugs have stayed on the market because they are incredibly useful drugs that are not addictive. People at high risk of heart disease probably shouldn't take them long term, but for people at low risk of heart trouble, the very slight increase in risk is far offset by the fact that they aren't addictive and people aren't going to overdose on them. At the very worst, Vioxx is still far safer than opioid drugs. The proper response to the discovery of Vioxx's cardiovascular side effects should have just been a simple label update, as well as more stringent prescription requirements that factored in a patient's health history. It is tragic that some people died while on Vioxx, of course, but it's not nearly as big of a tragedy as all the lives that could have been saved if Vioxx had not been taken off the market, since the alternative they went for are opioids, and they are far more deadly. Just think about how many people have died from fentanyl overdoses as opposed to how many people would have died from Vioxx. Anyways, I could probably make an entire video on the Vioxx scandal, and as a matter of fact, I already did make a video on it, and I'll link that video below. So let me be clear, chums. For as much as I support the pharmaceutical industry, it still has some big problems that demand greater government regulations and accountability. And I say that as a free market capitalist, so I don't make that demand lightly. Now, I know sticking up for mainstream organizations as maligned as Big Pharma isn't considered popular or cool, but why is that exactly? In the age of social media, taking the mainstream position on any issue will rarely get much positive attention. We're living in the age where if you want to be cool, you need to be a contrarian. And that is why people who speak out against the mainstream position get the most attention on social media. That's why you see quacks who promote fringe health claims like Eric Berg, Ken Berry, and Stephen Gundry get far more attention and views than doctors who promote the more mainstream medical opinions. I don't know exactly why this is, but I think a lot of it has to do with arrogance. Narcissistic people tend to gravitate towards fringe contrarian opinions because it makes them feel special to believe they know better than everybody else. There is even scientific evidence showing people who have narcissistic personality disorder tend to be conspiracy theorists. So it is no surprise arrogant people tend to love these fringe health theories and the conspiracy theorists who promote them. It is because it feeds their ego. People like to feel like rebels because rebels are cooler than sheep. And what better way to feel like a rebel than to cherry-pick fringe research to support your biases while ignoring the mountains of evidence that contradicts your viewpoints. Now, of course, that's not to say that the scientific consensus should never be challenged. Indeed, just because the majority of researchers and scientists believe something, that doesn't automatically make it true. But if you want to challenge the scientific consensus, then you need to challenge the existing research with data that is of a similar quality. So for instance, if you want to claim a meta-analysis demonstrating that smoking has a causative role in the development of lung cancer and heart disease is wrong, then you need to show a meta-analysis yourself that contradicts it. What you can't do is say the scientific consensus is incorrect because you have a grandfather who smoked and lived to 90. But I get it. It's not fun going along with the scientific consensus. We as human beings crave attention, and we want to stand out to all of our Facebook friends and look cool. So we have to be rebels and stand up against scientific tyranny, don't we? So how did this rebellious streak, which has led to this widespread contrarianism, happen? I think the reason in a nutshell is that sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, science actually does get it wrong. It may be right 99.99% of the time, but when it's wrong, people can seize and amplify on that and then jump to the unwarranted conclusion that it is usually or always wrong. Here's an example. Back in the 1990s, there was a big push against saturated fats. Anyone who grew up in the 90s probably remembers the "I cannot believe it's not butter" ads featuring Fabio. So, how do we go from that to people today putting butter in their coffee or literally just eating sticks of butter and claiming that it is a health food? Well, I think it is because marketers made a huge mistake in the 1990s. They thought that just because too much butter is bad, that meant that any edible butter alternative had to be good, or at least better for you, right? So what they did is they developed these butter alternatives instead that were absolute abominations of chemistry and science that were made from partially hydrogenated oils containing trans fats. Trans fats, as any cardiologist will tell you, promote heart disease. They are worse than saturated fats. They are much worse. They're so bad that they're now banned in most parts of the world, including the United States, although the ban hasn't fully gone into effect yet everywhere, which is why some products still contain trans fats. So simply put, it was wrong of food manufacturers to promote these poisons as being healthier alternatives to butter. They didn't have any good science backing up their claims. They just assumed that any alternative to butter would be better than butter itself. However, the 1990s is ancient history now, and today the pendulum has swung way, way too far in the other direction. Just because the mainstream belief about butter alternatives was wrong in the 1990s does not mean that the mainstream belief is always wrong. In fact, we've gotten to the point where it is debatable if the mainstream position should even be considered the mainstream position anymore. What I mean by that is that if the majority of people believe in the opposite of the mainstream position, then does that really make them rebels, or are they the real sheep now? The question of all things reminds me of something the YouTuber Lauren Southern said several years ago. Lauren Southern, for those who don't know, is a trad thought alt-right Canadian YouTuber who is mostly popular with incel simps and boomers who get excited at seeing a pretty young woman affirm their beliefs. So, I'm obviously not a fan of hers, but she did say something once that I think applies perfectly to what I'm saying now. She said being conservative is the new punk. I know that sounds incredibly cringeworthy, but what she was basically saying is that being conservative is now cool or counterculture. I'm not going to get into that, as I think all politics are lame, and I hate political extremism whether it comes from the left or the right, but I think her philosophy applies perfectly to the mainstream position on science and medicine. What I'm telling you here, Coombs, is that the pendulum has swung, and now being for the mainstream position is the new punk, while taking the contrarian position makes you the real sheep. Being for mainstream medicine in the 2020s is like being for Macintosh in the 1990s. So in that respect, it is people like me who defend the pharmaceutical industry who are the real health rebels now. That is because I support pharmaceuticals as being the most evidence-based intervention method for solving the majority of the world's health problems, and now I am going to show all the contrarian sheep just how foolish they are for trusting their health to butter, bone broth, and coconut oil over FDA-approved medications. Big Pharma, despite its faults, is good, and to be against Big Pharma is to be against science itself. So let's let the rebellion begin. These anti-pharmaceutical sheep have fooled themselves into believing that pharmaceuticals are unnecessary and harmful. None of this is based on any scientific evidence, as they are all completely scientifically illiterate and incapable of reading any study beyond just the title, abstract, and a summary of cherry-picked studies which support their confirmation bias. So instead, they'll back up their arguments by looking at the ancestral wisdom of our forebears, by engaging in the practices of our ancestors from the ancient world. You know, like sharing Facebook memes featuring profound quotes from antiquity like, "Let food be thy medicine." Now, with all due respect to Greek philosophers like Hippocrates and all the other wise men from the ancient world who extolled the medicinal benefits of food, they are all full of shit. Food is not medicine. It never has been, and it never will be. The only reason the ancients may have said food was medicine is because medicine practically didn't even exist back then. There were no research tools like randomized control trials to measure how well people eating certain foods responded to certain diseases compared to control groups. There were no meta-analyses. Hell, they didn't even have the scientific method back then, for Pete's sakes. I'm sure Hippocrates was smarter than your average toga wearer back then, and if he were born 2,000 years later, he probably would have been a scientist. But the point is that the tools to measure things like the safety and efficacy of medicine didn't exist in the ancient world, so it is stupid to defer judgment to people who couldn't possibly scientifically validate any of their claims. Science was a concept that barely even existed yet back then. The ancient Greeks hadn't even figured out yet that the sun was a star, just like the thousands of other stars we see in the night sky, albeit much closer to Earth. There were, of course, many brilliant people who existed during ancient times, but civilization just hadn't progressed far enough yet for us to figure out the things we know about medicine today. Now, of course, that is not to say that food doesn't play any role in a healthy lifestyle. Of course it does. But food is just one component of healthy living, and it cannot possibly account for everything that can go wrong health-wise with an individual, since literally every disease on the planet, including androgenic alopecia, has a genetic component to it. The only real exceptions are infectious diseases from bacteria and viruses. Other than that, chances are it's going to be genetic-based. You can make a case, of course, that a healthy lifestyle and diet can mitigate the chances of developing diseases, but food can't solve everything, and that is why you need medicine. Let's face it, Coombs, the reason we can even sit around and argue on social media platforms is completely related to progress we have made in science and technology. Otherwise, we'd be messing each other using things like carrier pigeons instead of using pocket-sized computers that are estimated to be 120 million times more powerful than the computers on the Apollo moon missions that people now ironically use to argue that the Apollo mission was faked. Medicine is a critical component of science, so if you hate medicine, you hate science. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. It is ironic that it is science itself that has brought us computers, the internet, and social media, which is then used to amplify anti-scientific rhetoric. If Facebook were around in the 1800s to give a platform to every idiot with access to the internet, we probably would have never cured tuberculosis, which back in the 1800s was one of the biggest killers of young people. In fact, as medicine has become more and more prominent, longevity has steadily improved over the last 100 or so years. Some of this is due to things like improved sanitation, but most of it is due to drugs developed by medical research companies. Some diseases that used to plague humanity have been completely wiped out, or at least nearly wiped out, like smallpox, polio, tuberculosis, and syphilis. You should thank Big Pharma that you don't have to deal with those diseases today. Some childhood killers like measles were essentially eliminated until people decided not to trust science anymore and stop getting their kids vaccinated like complete idiots, which has resulted in big increases in measles outbreaks across the world. So modern medicine developed by Big Pharma has literally saved billions of people. But sadly, the growing distrust over medical science has had a negative effect on our health, and it puts future generations at risk of dying from completely treatable diseases. We need continual pharmaceutical research in order to develop vaccines and antibiotics to combat pandemics and superbugs that will definitely arise in the future as viruses and bacteria are continually evolving to become resistant to existing treatments. Thanks to modern databases and advanced statistical methods, we can even judge the impact of drug research on human longevity. This article here tackles this question. The article was able to estimate that pharmaceutical innovation added 1.23 years to longevity in the 26 countries included in the study. And this was just during a period of 10 years from 2006 to 2016. So, if you think about it, the much maligned pharmaceutical industry is adding about a year of life to the human race every decade. Finally, let's tackle the argument that Big Pharma is greedy and only cares about profits. Well, profit motives are not necessarily a bad thing here, chooms. The desire to make money is inherent in any capitalistic economic system, since the urge to get rich is what drives the development of new products. Capitalism works. That's why most of the hair loss research we see these days comes from good capitalist Korea instead of bad Marxist Korea. Developing drugs that improve and save the lives of millions of people requires the collective knowledge and talents of thousands of the very best scientists, doctors, chemists, and pharmacists, and last time I checked, they don't exactly work for free now, do they? So, who's gonna fund them? Government? Don't be stupid. It's Big Pharma that funds these drugs, and if you've ever in your life used a pharmaceutical, which let's face it, everybody has, then you have Big Pharma to thank for it. And you're a hypocrite if you hate Big Pharma despite having benefited from their products. Sometimes, the desire to make money can be taken too far, which leads to some of the problems I mentioned at the beginning of this video, hence why there is need for greater government oversight to prevent some of the worst excesses of capitalism. However, when it comes to greed, critics of Big Pharma conveniently ignore the greediest, most corrupt, and most unethical industry to ever exist in the history of mankind. The big supplement industry, also known as Big Placebo. Unlike Big Pharma, Big Placebo is poorly regulated by the FDA. They don't have to back up any of the claims they make about their product as long as their claims are vague and they say things like natural male enhancement instead of penis enlargement. This loose regulation in the United States is due to a specific law called the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994. It was pushed through by big supplement lobbyists, and it gives supplement makers much more liberty with their claims than Big Pharma. Basically, the law says that Big Supplement doesn't have to back up their claims as long as they write something on their packaging insert that says something like, "These claims have not been evaluated by the FDA." So what that means is that Big Placebo is legally allowed to lie about the products they are selling to you. It is possible for the FDA to remove supplements currently on the market, and supplement manufacturers can still be sued, but the profit margins for these supplement companies are often so astronomically high that they easily offset any future litigation, so they deem it's worthwhile to sell it anyways. For instance, let's look at the example of collagen supplements. Collagen, it's usually manufactured by boiling animal carcasses, and the makers of collagen supplements in the form of powders or even bone broth make all sorts of wild health claims that collagen helps with skin health. Yet the scientific evidence to back up their claims is extremely weak or even non-existent. I went over all this in my video on collagen supplements, which I'll link below, but I was happy to see an article in the Washington Post just from today that makes all the same points I made in my video. The article points out that the evidence for collagen supplementation is extremely weak or extremely biased because the articles are often funded by the supplement makers themselves. It also makes the point that collagen is broken up in the digestive system, and so there's no indication it actually gets into the skin at all. Instead of taking collagen, the article recommends avoiding smoking, and it says we should use sunscreen and topical retinoids, which are clinically proven to benefit skin health. So collagen sales are still through the roof completely, and that's despite the lack of evidence that collagen is beneficial, and the FDA, they just let it happen because they are handcuffed by the very lax regulation of Big Placebo. Just to put this all into perspective, could you imagine a new antibiotic getting approved after being tested in just a handful of subjects and the test barely showed any effect at all? Could you imagine the drug company claiming this antibiotic was the best possible treatment for pneumonia without having to back up that claim with any scientific evidence? No, that would be completely impossible because unlike with big placebo, drug companies have very strict rules for establishing efficacy and safety that involve the testing in hundreds if not thousands of subjects. If you take an FDA-approved medication, you know its efficacy has been well established. If you take a supplement, on the other hand, you know by definition that there is no proof that it works. If there was proof, the manufacturer would have to provide that proof, and if it really did work for a medical condition, it would have to get through FDA approval. Because they don't have to back up their claims though, like collagen supplements help rejuvenate the skin or may help prevent wrinkles, Big Placebo avoids having to do the expensive research and development that Big Pharma has to do, so they end up with more profits as a consequence. And when we say profits, we're not talking about chicken feed here, chooms. Big Supplement ranked in $156 billion in 2022, $167 billion in 2023, and is expected to grow to $239 billion by the year 2028. Now, if you look at revenues from the top 10 pharmaceutical companies, they look relatively modest. And remember, these graphs show total revenue, not actual profit, since drug companies still need to invest in research and development where supplement makers don't have to do any of that. Finally, I'd like to reiterate a point I made earlier that everybody who is critical of Big Pharma is a hypocrite, since they at some point in their life have definitely benefited from Big Pharma due to the ubiquity of drugs. Even if someone today says they can get by without taking any pharmaceuticals, their opinion will likely change if they were faced with some life-threatening disease. If they develop pneumonia, would they really refuse antibiotics, for example? If they had a heart attack or blood clot, would they really refuse a blood thinner? If they were in extreme pain, would they just tough it out, or would they take a painkiller? Or let's say they had acute appendicitis. Would they just bite the bullet while the surgeon operated? Or would they take advantage of general anesthesia so they don't feel a thing? Even considering hair loss, which is the condition that afflicts most viewers of this channel, if it weren't for modern medicine, we'd still be falling for stupid scams like the Helsinki formula. If it weren't for the scientists like Dr. Julian Imperato McGinley, who figured out that DHT is a trash hormone, and if it weren't for the drug companies who were able to invest tons of money to do all the chemical research and clinical trials to come up with drugs like finasteride, dutasteride, and minoxidil, we'd still be at the mercy of all these snake oil salesmen who offer us hopes and dreams in exchange for our souls. Let's face it, chums, the hope for the future of hair loss isn't going to be that someone fixes it by coming up with a fancy new way to do scalp massages, or some new type of braces or surgery to fix dental malocclusion, and it isn't going to be some new ancient Chinese herbal remedy that somehow gets rediscovered after several centuries. The new treatments for hair loss are going to first be tested in the basic research laboratory, and then they are going to undergo FDA clinical trials, which is a process that the vast majority of time results in a safe and effective new treatment. And my job here, chooms, will be to keep you posted on all of those exciting new developments from Big Pharma. So yes, I do love Big Pharma, but I don't love Big Pharma unconditionally, like the way a child loves his mother, for instance. I love Big Pharma the way someone loves their spouse, whom they occasionally have arguments with. I love the many benefits Big Pharma's products have given me over the course of my lifetime, while at the same time, I acknowledge their faults and I encourage them to get better. Big Pharma is not perfect by any means, but Big Pharma is by far the best thing we've got. So if you really hate Big Pharma, just take a moment to imagine where your life would be today without Big Pharma, and then ask yourself, is that the kind of world I want to live in? Thank you for watching, Hair Loss Witchers. God bless.